The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
You are back in the House of Mystery, and we are at the interview part of the show. And we're coming up with great crime fiction authors lately. We've been kind of expanding into some of the new categories. Now, today we have a person that has done some great books. His new book is called A Beautiful Corpse, and it's a Marshall James thriller. He has several other books. It looks like he publishes as well with Mark and does a little podcast himself. So thanks for being on the show, Mark McNease.
My pleasure. And I was just going to say real quick, the Marshall James, I'm adopted. My birth name was James Marshall. So the character, the lead character in that series is a play on my birth name.
Oh, it's funny. I was going to ask you that. I was going to say, who is Marshall James? Is that you? Like, where do you get your character from? There you go.
Yeah. Well, that's where I got his name.
Oh, you didn't live all this adventure?
No, but I did live in New York for 25 years.
Oh, God. Still alive, too. Now, how did you get into writing? Like, what brought you into this world of writing and crime fiction as well?
Well, that's a two-part question. Writing, I started when I was a child. I remember writing short stories when I honestly was not more than 10 years old. I had a stuffed Saint Bernard, not a taxidermy stuffed, it was a toy Saint Bernard, but he was very big though. And I wrote a short story about my dog, and that started it off. And I just kept writing for years and years and years, and it went in phases. I wrote short stories for 10 years, and I wrote just poetry for 10 years, and then for 10 years I wrote plays, had a number of those produced. And then 8 years ago, maybe 9 years ago, I was at a LGBT resort in the Poconos that hopefully still exists. We're waiting to see who's going to still be in business after all this stuff has going on with the lockdown and everything.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
But it's a resort, and we went there, and I said, this would be a great place to set a murder mystery to my husband. And so I did. I wrote one. I'd never written one before, but that was my first murder mystery, and that series, I'm now finishing the 6th book. It's called Kyle Callahan Mysteries. 6th book in that one, and that's how I got into crime writing.
Did you? Well, it's actually, before we get it, has this COVID-19 and all of this issue and lockdown and all that, does this cause or have an effect on the way you write?
No, because one of the things I love about writing and am a writer as opposed to something more public like an actor or some performer is that the isolation of it. I can create with just me and a keyboard because nobody's looking at me. So my imagination has no impediment. I don't censor myself when I'm as a writer. It's a pure form of just imagination for me, along with being a craft. But so the lockdown doesn't affect that at all. I've been getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning for decades because I've always held a regular job. So I write in the mornings before I go to work. So that has not been impacted at all by the lockdown.
Yeah, but I just wonder, when something dark is happening in the world, like right now, there's a lot of turmoil, right? You look at the U.S. where you live, and you look at, the things going on with people protesting and all the deaths and stuff. Does that darkness come into your writing?
Only if I were writing something that was involved that currently. Like if I were writing a story that was taking place right now, it certainly would. It would be part of the story because I write about where I live and what I'm going, what I go through and what I see around me. But I'm working on things now that aren't in that time frame. So. Also I work. I'm a quote essential worker. I work in a grocery store, so I have never stopped working all this time. I've been going to work 5 days a week.
Mm. So now your characters that you write about, like in the crime fiction, like where you've got Beautiful Corpse, and Marshall James, or James Marshall is where you got the name. Now, how do you develop that character over several books, and how do you like, what is it that you draw? This is really interesting because I've only written true crime, and so I write about characters that, I find out the facts and kind of just do that. But you actually have to take a character and several characters and develop them throughout the story, how they act and react to different, events in the book and stuff. Where does that come from?
Well, some of it comes from, I wrote short stories for a long time, and I could write a short story without an outline, so I didn't have to do character biographies. But then I started writing plays, and character biographies became an essential part of playwriting, W-R-I-G-H-T, because it's like building a ship. So I got into the habit then of writing out a character biography. I used to do it for every character. I don't do that anymore. It's very time-consuming. And I'm better now. Once a character is established, they develop over the course of if it's a character that's in several books, and mine tend to be series, they develop over the course of the books. The first book, they might be a little rough. They also develop over the course of an individual book. A character, I discover them as well as write them, so that when I started the first Marshall James book, it was called Murder at the Paisley Parrot. I create the character, I start writing it, and then I learn more about him or her, because I also have a series with a woman protagonist, Maggie Dahl. And I'm just trying to say that they fill out as I write, and I learn things about them that I didn't know on page one. So even writing the book itself is a way of character development. And a lot of times they surprise me. I mean, they really do surprise me. A lot of times.
So you do, they almost come to life then, right? These characters, some of them are actually, they're real in your mind, so to speak.
Oh, yes, they are real, and they're beloved. I mean, I get really attached to my characters. Like the Kyle Callahan character, he has a husband named Danny Durbin, and his best friend is a retired detective named Linda. She was a lesbian. But they take on a life of their own, and like I'm writing this new one of his because I wanted to give them some kind of, I hate the word closure, but I wanted to bring that series to an end, whether I write another one or not, because I owed it to them, not just to me, but I owed it to the characters to give them some kind of ending. And the Marshall James book, the one that we have been talking about, I just contracted with a really good narrator to do the audiobook because I wanted him to have a really good audiobook. I wanted to find somebody who could do justice to the characters. So they are very much, they're not throwaways to me. They're not the central characters. I don't write them and invest all that time and effort to just get up and walk away and think of them as nothing more than figments of my imagination.
Well, I find that interesting. I don't quite get the concept, but that's just not not the type of writer I am, I guess. When we talked to J.D. Horn last week, he was saying that he put people that he knew that he really didn't like in his book as characters. So if he used, if someone says, like when someone says you use people, am I in your book, or you get people like that, he said if you were in his book, he really doesn't like you. So is that sort of something that you can relate to, or is that not?
I can relate to them as murder victims, definitely, because I jokingly said to people, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to put you in my book and I'm going to kill you. I get to kill people as a writer of murder fiction. I get to kill people and get away with it. But often there are a lot of people in my life or in my books with a name change and some other things. I like to do that. I like to write about what I know. For instance, we recently, it's been like almost 3 years now, we have a house in rural New Jersey. We lived in New York City. So all my books were set in New York City because I know the city really well. And then we moved out here to our house in New Jersey. And strangely, all of my characters moved to Lambertville, New Jersey, because I like to write about the environment that I'm living in. And I definitely put people that I know in my books.
Would it be enough for them to recognize themselves in the book? Would it always be like for like, or?
No, I don't think so. And it tends to, when I do that, it's a minor character. And I'll put names, people's names. I use their first names. I'll use their names. But if I'm going to put somebody in my book, it tends to be like a minor character, a sort of an inside, not an inside joke, but an inside thing where I recognize it and they might recognize it. The readers certainly won't. And for instance, the couple, Kyle and Danny managed a restaurant called Margaret's Passion. Margaret was my mother's name. And I've always loved the name, so I was doing homage to my mother by putting that in there. So yeah, that's kind of how I do it.
And in terms of some of your plots, do they come from real life experiences that you or friends may have had, or what are your influences?
They come from places more, like with the Kyle Callahan. I keep bringing that up because I've written 6 of those. I was taking pictures, and there was the pool at this resort was empty, and it was a beautiful image of this empty blue pool with leaves in the bottom, and I took a picture of it, and that's what inspired the first book, because I imagined a dead body at the bottom of the pool, a handyman and then it was a handyman who worked there, and then it was all about like who killed him, why was he dead at the bottom of the pool, so that comes into play, and then also the fact that I lived in Los Angeles for 12 years. So the Marshall James books, it's current because he's almost 60 now, but he's telling stories about these murders that he was involved in. When I say that, he's not a killer, he's a protagonist, but he happened to get caught up in several murders in Los Angeles in the 1980s. So it allows me to go back and write about 1980s Los Angeles. And that's the kind of thing that I love doing.
Would you, if you'd had another career, would you have liked to have been in crime enforcement, or as a police officer or detective yourself? Well,
I would have liked forensics. Maybe a lot of people think that would be fun, but a cop. It's hard to say because I grew up. I'm 61, and I grew up at a time where for a gay man to be a police officer was kind of like not really an option. Nowadays, I would probably be interested, but I would be much more interested. I know you have to work your way up to being a detective. You don't get to be a detective generally without having been a beat cop first and that kind of thing, and working your way up. That doesn't interest me, but I'd love to just like magically be a homicide detective. For sure.
You can do that in the UK. You can now you can. You never used to be able to. Or clearly, you'd have to work your way up from a police constable and so forth. Now you can go in as a direct entry inspector, or even a direct entry. So as long as you've got the qualifications, you go through their series of training, and you can go in as an inspector, which is a detective, or you can go into superintendent.
Well, I would be interested in, like I said, in the CSI sort of aspect of it, or ballistics would interest me, the science end of it, or as a private investigator.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Searching out all sorts of stuff. Now, this book that you've just written, now it's part of the Marshall James thrillers. Maybe give the listeners a little rundown of what the book is about, the story.
Well, I've decided when I first thought it out in my head that it's a limited series. I love doing these things that are a little bit on the hyperbolic side, but it's 3 books. It's going to be 3 books. This is the second book. The first book, it's Marshall James, as I mentioned. He's me living in New York, but he's a cancer survivor. I'm not. Fortunately, I've never had cancer. But he realizes in the first book that maybe he's going to beat this and maybe he's not. So he wants to get it on the record that there were these 3 big events in his life as a young 20-something in Los Angeles that involved murders and murderers. So we go back in time in each book. It opens in the present, and then in New York City, and then it goes back in time and tells a story. And in the first two books are connected. The third book is not really going to be part of the gay bar mob thing. But in the second book, it's kind of hard to explain without a little bit of the first book. In the first book, he's working he gets a job in a bar as a bartender in a gay bar, like a real dive gay bar, not a dance place. And the mob runs it, and there's a murder, and he ends up being a suspect and all this stuff, and he falls in love with this cop detective. And in the second book, it's 6 months later, maybe it's a year later. No, it's 6 months later. He's sober. He's not drinking anymore, and he's living with the homicide detective Mac McElroy. People really like their relationship. And in the second book, everything looks like it's going great. He's working at a different bar, even though he's not drinking. He had to get out of the Paisley Parrot milieu, the mob milieu. But they have a fight, and he goes to a bathhouse, because that's what a lot of us did in the 1980s. I guess they still do. I don't know. It's been an awfully long time since I was with a place like that. But he goes to a bathhouse, and somebody chats him up and offers to buy him a Diet Coke. He says, okay. He goes to the bathroom. He comes back. And the next thing, he wakes up in the morning next to a beautiful corpse. That's where the title comes from. A dead body of a young man. And he was drugged. He certainly didn't kill the guy. And he goes running off, and that sets the whole story in motion. And once again, somebody is setting him up to take the fall for a beautiful corpse. And that's it. He's out. He's trying to find out who set him up, and at the same time, make sure he's not the next victim. The cops are going to figure out that he was in this bathhouse room, really soon, and his lover, detective, can't really help him because he can't do that. He's a police detective. So he kind of says, you've got 72 hours before you have to turn yourself in, Marshall. And Marshall says, okay, I'm going to try to figure out who is doing this. And that's the whole book. And it brings us to the end, and there is a connection to the first book that I can't say.
You could tell us, but you'd have to kill us.
Yes, and it sets up that there will be a third book. But like I said, the third book is not going to involve the characters from the first two, the villains, I should say.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. Do you read a lot of crime fiction yourself?
I do, but I tend to read. I have favorite authors, like Michael Connelly. I'm going to guess you've heard of him. He's wrote the Bosch books, the Harry Bosch books. Right. They're on Amazon. I love that series. Oh my God, it's so good. There's going to be one more series of Bosch on Amazon. But I've been reading Michael Connelly for many, many, many years, since the books began. And also John Sanford, he writes the Prey novels. P.D. James was to me a master of the mystery. So there's a bunch that I have read, and I like series. I gravitate towards series because the characters get old with me. Like Harry Bosch is in his 60s now, just like me. And when I started reading the books, he was in his 40s. So I do read. I don't read as much as I used to. I used to read a book. I used to read before I went to bed. That's how I went to bed. There was no television when I was single. There was no TV in the bedroom. So I would read before I went to sleep, and consequently, I would read maybe a book a week, if possibly more. And now it might take me a month to read a book.
Well, I can relate that. I listen to a lot of books now. I'm not reading as much. Just my old eyes just don't do it like they used to. Made Mark Publishing, is that you?
That is me. That's the mark in there is Made Mark. Made Mark Publishing. I started that quite a while ago because I did a website for LGBT people over 50 called LGBTSR, LGBT Senior. So I'm not going to call it an imprint. I mean, I've used it as an imprint where I had my own ISBNs and all of that. But it's really just an umbrella for the different things I do. The books I published, I'll say Made Mark Publishing on them. Yeah, so it is me.
Do you find it a problem? We've talked about this with a few people. Do you think it's an issue that to publish stories that involve gay characters? Is it an issue? Is it still tough to do amongst mainstream publishing?
I don't think so. It's harder for me to speak to that because I'm very much an independent publisher. I like that term. I know that most people would call it self-publishing. So it's harder for me to say, but I just don't think so. I think that from what I read, unless it's really gay, like unless it's queer fiction, then you're going to end up with a publisher, a smaller publisher. I'm going to assume who specializes in that. But like Michael Connelly, if he wanted to write a book with a gay character, I don't think he would have any problem. I don't think that I just think it's kind of just like with marriage equality. I think to a large extent we've been assimilated, and I'm going to think that for a mainstream publisher, it's more about how many books can they sell, and who's the audience for this. But the fact that the characters are gay, I don't think is going to be a major issue unless they don't think people are going to buy it because of that. But I don't think that's so true anymore.
Yeah. When we talked to Matt Luber Moore, he sort of mentioned that it was still pretty difficult for a gay writer to write a gay character and publish it in a mainstream publisher. So,
well, I know Matt.
Yeah.
And he could. Then I'm going to go with him but he would be definitely more versed in that than I am, because I do write. I do publish myself, and I write in a niche, but I also write mainstream books. I have a book called A House in the Woods. It's a thriller, psychological thriller, with a young straight couple. There's no gay characters in there except her uncle. So it's harder for me to speak to the reality of that, because I haven't done it. I haven't tried to, get St. Martin's Press or Doubleday to publish my books.
Right. Wow. So now you're doing a little podcast. Now, tell the listeners what your podcast is about.
I have a podcast called One Thing or Another. The title comes from a column I write, I try to write, called One Thing or Another. It's always one thing or another. It's just basically a life. The column was really about a light-hearted look at life aging and the absurdities of it all. And the podcast is just interviews and conversations. I wanted to be able to just talk to people that I find interesting. I've interviewed authors and cat behaviorists. Molly DeVos out in Dallas. It's fascinating. She's like a really, really licensed and knowledgeable cat behaviorist, and she helped us with our cats because we just recently, a year and a half ago, we adopted 2 new adult cats because we lost our elderly ones. So, Holly Palance, who is a audiobook narrator and the son of Jack Palance, the late Jack Palance. Mm-hmm. So I interviewed people that I think are interesting. And I really wanted to stay away from getting into a niche, I didn't want to, number one, I didn't want to just interview authors, because I had done a lot of that under different auspices. I had a different podcast. I've interviewed a lot of authors, especially a lot of authors I know. And I wanted to be able to maybe talk to the owner of a cheese shop, or I talked to the owner of or the woman who is the artistic director of a local theater here in Lambertville. That's what that podcast is about. It's usually, I try to keep it to about 30 minutes and just talk to fascinating people, or people who fascinate me. I hope they fascinate other people. I don't know. But it's called One Thing or Another, and you can find it at onethingoranotherpodcast.com.
Who would be your ideal person to interview on there, if you had a choice of anybody?
Oh my God, that's like who would you want to have dinner with? My first thoughts are Carol Burnett. Somebody that I know. I don't know him. I just know that he recently interviewed Titus Welliver from Bosch. To me, that would be a fabulous interview, or somebody like that. Somebody who's on a show that I watch, Christina Applegate, or it could be an author, but I would probably go with an author who's not necessarily well known. Maybe a more obscure author, the author of a book that really had an impact on me, or so it's hard for me to say. I don't automatically go to celebrity at all,
I think that's great. When we do these interviews, we quite often will say to somebody that Al and I will bounce off each other. We take the mickey out of each other constantly. We're friends. It comes through when we're having banter, and so we like to have a conversation as opposed to a Q&A session with somebody, which doesn't always work. Sometimes it's better to be more formal. Other times it's just a conversation. And I quite like the way you said that you really like to talk to anybody that fascinates you, or that you might want to know a little bit more about, so somebody from the local shop, etc., or a local profession. I really like that idea. I think that is more telling and more informative to the listener sometimes than something that is quite pigeonholed.
Yes, and I just thought of somebody who's on my wish list for interviews, and it's the mayor of Lambertville, New Jersey. We don't live in Lambertville. We live in the woods. We live in a very rural area, but about 15 minutes from a town called Lambertville. That I love Lambertville so much. But the mayor, she's a lesbian, and she unseated the mayor who'd been in there for many, many years. A couple years ago, I would love to interview her if she happens to hear this.
Wow.
There we go.
And we're not on his list now, just to be clear. He's not mentioned us once.
No, that's because we're talking.
Yeah.
I'm already sort of interviewing you.
We're okay. We're fine. We'll cope.
Well, nobody likes me anyway. Nobody ever. No, they wouldn't want me on there. Wow. So, where do you see yourself going? Are you going to continue writing like this, or are you going to start doing other things?
Well, my big dream, oh please, if dreams come true, is to, quote, retire. I'm not going to stop working because, unlike my husband, who is retired and stays very busy all the time, I do everything creatively in the morning, I write in the morning, and by the afternoon, I'm like, what am I going to do with myself? So I will continue working, but I currently work for health insurance. Now, in the United States, that's very common. That's extremely common. People work for the health insurance. So I don't hate where I work, but I would like to not be tied to the job for the health insurance. So my big thing is I want to retire. I'm going to keep writing probably till I drop dead. I've always thought that, because it's something you can do. Unless your mind starts to slip, you can write, forever. Unless you run out of ideas. I do think artists have creative lives, and I think a lot of them keep going beyond their prime, whether it's Tennessee Williams or somebody else. I mean, it's just an arc. So I may not be writing, and when I'm 70, I may not be writing with the with the edge or the skill that I have at 60. But I do want to write. I'm just not going to stop until I run out of ideas.
Is there something you want people to get out of your books when they read them? Is there some sort of underlying feature or thought or something that you want people to understand after they read one of your books?
I want them to, first of all, I consider myself an entertainer. I think I wrote literary fiction for years. That's what I did. I come out of a literary fiction background. It is a thing for anybody who's like, what's literary fiction? It's not a snobbish thing. It actually is there's literary fiction. And I wrote that for a long time. So I think that infuses what I write, especially my narrative. I think I'm good at what I do. I want people to go like, oh, he's good at what he does. He's not just another person who decided to, start writing gay mysteries, and so I want people to know that I'm good at what I do, and that I take turning those pages seriously. I want to keep them engaged and keep them going like, oh, wow, I love that. And that I take my craft seriously. That I'm not a hack. I don't think I'm a hack. And I just sort of lost my train of thought. But you said, what did I want people to take away from the books? Oh, and also that older characters are cool. Older characters are great. You know, I wrote the one book with the young couple. I am going to write a sequel because of I was disturbed by the ending of the book, and so I thought I have to write a second book so she wins. But I tend to write older characters, and I think a lot of people appreciate that. I've been told a lot of times from readers who go like, "That's really great." You know, you don't just write. See, you asked me if there were things I didn't want to talk about before we started, and I will never ever put a naked torso on a book cover of mine. I just won't. I'm not going to knock the people I know who do that. I'm not going to knock all of the straight women who are writing gay mysteries. That's MM romance, whatever. That's their thing. I don't care. I don't read them. They can do what they want to do. But I write older characters. I'm not out to be salacious or to sell more copies because there's a sex scene. I don't write sex scenes. So I want people to take that away from my books. That they can have that they can have fun and be engaged and be kept involved in a story with older people. You know, am I making any sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know,
I think one of the things that I think it's about being real and true to yourself and your beliefs, isn't it? So it's you don't want and don't need to sell things through sex. You know, that's the bottom line. The characters have more depth than just the sex life. And I think one of the things that I was listening to just now that I know our listeners will have picked up on is your reference to taking your cats to a cat behaviourist. And I spent the last 5 minutes thinking, what were they doing? why I'm intrigued by these cats. So I'm really sorry because I know this is really random, but I have to ask the question because it's in my head.
Oh, well, what happened was, like I said, we had to euthanize our two elderly cats that we had. One of them was 18, Jessie. She was my little buddy. Wow. She slept with me for 18 years. So we lost them, and I can't imagine a home without animals, companions. And so we went to the SPCA in Bucks County in Pennsylvania, and we saw this little just like Spitfire cat named Wilma. Well, we named her Wilma. She was named Mabel, but no. So we renamed her Wilma. And it said on the sign that she came from a hoarder situation. We didn't want kittens at all. She was 3 years old when we got her. But she was so adorable. We bring her home, and she's a mess. Like this cat has issues. She won't come out from the couch, and it was really not something I'd ever encountered. And then we got a second cat because that's just how I am. I want two cats. And this one is 5. Her name is Peanut. We did not change her name. And I put her upstairs, and she would try to come down, and Wilma wouldn't let her down. So there was all this stuff going on, and a friend on Facebook said, "Oh, you need to reach out to Molly DeVos in Dallas. She's a cat behaviorist." So I did, and she couldn't come to the house because she's in Texas. But we Skyped, and I sent her a diagram, and she was so helpful in the things that she told me. And she's got a podcast out, Cat Talk Radio, and she works with a shelter out in Dallas. She's just really, really good and knows what is going on with animals. With specifically cats. She's a cat behaviorist. For instance, Wilma, when we first got her, I put the litter box in the living room in the fireplace, by the fireplace, because you introduce them into a single room. That's the better way to do it. And she kept not using it. And I thought, where is this cat going to the bathroom? And there was a big pillow behind the couch, or on the side of the couch, behind the TV, like a big old pillow that just was there. And I discovered that that's where she had been going to the bathroom. And Molly said she wants privacy. Put the litter box behind the television. And I said, okay. So I did it, and voila, she was absolutely correct. So she told us a number of things that were going on with these animals, and they're best buddies now. They hang out together. I love them. The only thing that's weird is Wilma. The living room is her space. It's really hard to get her to do things in the other rooms, because this is where she was introduced and she kind of claimed this area. But Molly was really helpful, and I can't, because the last thing she said her mission is to decrease the number of cats that are euthanized for behavior problems, because it's not necessary. It's very rare that you actually have to put a cat down or get rid of it for behavior problems.
Exactly. Yeah, people need to be getting rescues all the time. They need to be doing that rather than buying them from, breeders and all that stuff. There's so many that need homes.
Yeah.
Wow. So now for the listeners, how do people get a hold of you? You have a website now?
Well, I've had a website for years, back when. You remember when blogging was a thing? I mean, people might think it still is, but 10 years ago, 12 years ago, maybe 15 now, blogs were a thing. It was before Facebook, before Twitter, so people had blogs. And that's when I started with a blog and a website. So my website is just my name, Mark McNease, MarkMcNease.com. And you pronounced it correctly, because sometimes people go McNease. I said, no, it's like it's like lease, grease, piece, McNease. So it's markmcnease.com, and you can find my books are all there. They can find it, the Maidmark Publishing. There's pages for everything, the publishing and the audiobooks. There are samples from the narrators who've done my audiobooks. Everything about me is there.
Fantastic. Now we're going to have that on our website as well. So people that are listening or come to the show, they can do one click and they'll go right to your website. And we recommend your books. Again, the person we're talking with today is author Mark McNease, and his latest book is called Beautiful Corpse. And it's a Marshall James thriller. Thank you for taking some time to talk to us today.
Well, thanks for having me on, and you're on my list now. You're both on my list.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
The mission has been completed.
The end! By George, he's got it! It is the end! I'll see you.
If you're lying to me, I'll be back.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.